You are listening to That Hoarder Overcome Compulsive Hoarding. I don't talk in real life about having hoarding disorder, so I talk about it on this podcast instead. And because I'm anonymous, I can talk really, really honestly. Subscribe to the podcast and find my social media links, episode transcripts, and every link that I mention at overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk. Finally, I am not a doctor. I'm just a hoarder doing her best. So do seek professional support if and when you need it. So I am here with Dr Jan Eppingstall, a counsellor in Melbourne, Australia, who specialises in working with people who hoard. Jan, how are you?
Fabulous. I'm very excited to talk to you about this topic today. So let's get into it.
I am going to start with what is almost certainly a one-off segment that I have not warned Jan about.
Ooh.
It is called 3 Things That Jan Recommends That I Resisted But Now Resentfully Agree Are Helpful.
Woohoo! Love it.
And this is based on my lifetime experience of I will not be told what to do, but when I work it out for myself, I can go, oh, do you know what? That's quite helpful.
Yes. Yes. Have we all been there or what?
I know. So number 1, I wasn't fully resistant to this idea, but it manifested recently in a way that was weirdly helpful. So Jan is a big advocate of curiosity, which I am too. But a few weeks ago, I was in a ridiculous amount of pain, and every day was miserable, and every day was just trying to get through while tolerating this awfulness. And this one particular day, I was being miserable and I was in a lot of pain. And then I had a different pain sensation to the one I had been trying to get used to. I thought, that's an interesting sensation. And then I made myself laugh because it felt like such a ridiculous thing to think, because it was actually an awful sensation. But because it was different, right, it was interesting. And then because I made myself laugh, I then went, that's just Jan and her curiosity.
Yes.
And I spent the day, every time I got to a point of thinking I cannot tolerate this pain, I would switch my thinking to, that's an interesting sensation. And while it didn't help with the pain, it did kind of keep making me laugh through the day on a day that was otherwise utterly miserable. And it did help me to slightly distance from the pain and see it in a slightly different way through curiosity.
You've leveled up. I can't believe it. You've leveled up.
Number 2 thing that Jan recommends that I resisted but now resentfully agree are helpful is Jan is a big advocate of gratitude.
Yes.
And writing down things you're grateful for, which I resisted a lot more actively than curiosity. I think because when you're young, if you're miserable, somebody goes, think of what you should be grateful for. And it really shuts you down rather than being something expansive. It's something very limiting. But as listeners know, I've been using this app called Finch, and it is this beautiful little bird, and you set yourself self-care tasks. And every time you complete one of your self-care tasks, the bird gets a little treat, or the bird gets to go on an adventure. And it's a very, very cute bird. And I am embarrassed by how much making the bird happy makes me happy. And so I have been nailing self-care tasks, mostly because of this app. And so it suggests some, and you can also add your own. And one of the ones it suggests is every day it says, think of somebody. Let me find it, actually. I want to get the wording right.
It's like a Tamagotchi.
It is, but doesn't become deformed and die if you don't keep up, importantly.
Yes, well, that is important. Is that the bird?
Yeah, right. There we are. So one of your care tasks is name one person who cares for me, right? And so every day I open the app and I actively think, who do I feel really loved by today? Or who has been really nice to me today? And so every day I just spend a second or two thinking, who do I feel really loved by today? And I just quietly name them in my own head. And I think over time, because it just marked my 102-day streak.
Wow.
I know.
Well done.
I do think it's doing me good to just spend 3 seconds every day thinking, oh, like today I feel cared for by Jan because she sent me a lovely message this morning, or today I feel cared for by whoever because they gave me a lovely hug. And I don't think I'll ever be a write down 10 things I'm grateful for at the end of the day person.
No.
But taking a moment to consciously feel gratitude, resentfully, I admit, it's a really nice thing.
Okay, I'm taking yeah. It's just that couple of seconds is all it takes.
Yeah.
But it because we're so biased towards negativity, we're always out there looking for the negative because we're human.
Yeah.
We've got to keep ourselves safe. So if we just look at that positive, that person who was nice or smiled to you, some of you walked past.
Yeah.
That stranger was nice to me today.
Yeah. The woman in Tesco was incredibly helpful when I couldn't find pesto. Or it could be anything. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. I think it does really work. I really feel it. So I'm happy you do too.
Thank you.
Little wiggle.
And number 3 thing that Jan recommends that I resisted, but now, and this is new, so I'm still testing the water with this, but now resentfully agree could be helpful, is, are you ready? Journaling.
Yeah!
Now, there are a number of reasons I don't tend to journal. One is that when I was a kid, I used to try and write a diary every day, and then I would fail, and that would feel horrible because diaries would have dates, and then there would be a big gap, and it used to make me feel like a failure.
Yeah, 100% understand that.
And then I would try and I would get non-dated, just like a nice notebook, and try a non-dated one, but I could never stick to it. And maybe I still can't stick to it. But the point is not, right, what I have maybe come to realize, again, this is new, so is that sticking to it isn't the point. The point is this helpful to do right now? It doesn't matter if I never do it again.
Yes.
So 2 weekends ago was miserable. I was struggling with my mental health quite considerably. And I found myself, I was distraught, and I didn't know what to do with all these thoughts and feelings, and it was horrible. And I found myself, I opened a text file on my computer, like the most basic, just in Notepad, no frills. And I just splurged all the things I was thinking and feeling onto this text file. And through the day, just kept adding to it. And then the next day, added a bit more. And then the next day, added a bit more. And then a few days later, I was in a cafe waiting for a friend. I was a bit early, and I was feeling a lot better by then. But I thought, oh, I've got a notebook in my bag. Maybe I can write a bit about how the day's been and how I'm feeling. And I realized that one thing I think I need to do is what I'm calling imperfect journaling. And that means sometimes it's in a text file, sometimes it's in a notepad that is otherwise full of to-do lists and work notes. And it needs to not involve a beautiful notebook or a schedule or expectations. The look on your face, Jan. You look so proud.
I'm feeling all goosebumpy. It's so cute.
It doesn't matter if after today I never do it again. It matters that in the moment on Saturday, when I felt like everything was dark, I did it and it helped.
Yeah. Like some sort of
the sun coming out from behind the clouds. And I'm going to add to, as on top of imperfect journaling, something else I did on that dark Saturday was I wrote a journal entry as if it was already Monday, basically saying, God, the weekend was rough, but I got through it.
Mm.
And then I wrote a list of ways I'd got through it, some of which were things I was already doing, and some of which were things I knew I should be doing, but wasn't able to.
So,
And so then it was written down that the way I got through the weekend was by doing these things, and that helped me to then do the things that I know to help.
mm.
And so there was something about, okay, something in me has faith that I can get through this weekend. And also, here are the tools I know I need.
And writing it down then manifested you
Yeah.
to manage that. Yeah.
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 And that's something I hadn't even planned. Just,
Mm.
it just kind of came out of my fingers and
I love
was
that.
actually quite powerful.
That's really amazing. That's awesome. I like that.
I needed to know I could get through it, and that reassured me a bit. But the tools thing, that this is how I got through it bit was,
Mm. Because once it's written down, once it's come through your hands and it's written
yeah,
down,
yeah,
then, like, we know the likelihood of you actually
yeah.
doing that, you're way more likely to do it if it's written down. Like, that's just,
And I did get through the weekend, and as ever,
mm,
afterwards said to people like Jan, God, that was a rough weekend.
that was a rough weekend, but I'm here. I'm here.
There were a couple of people who kind of saw me in it, but that's rare. I'm a lot more of an afterwards go, God, that was rough, than allowing, but I'm trying to work on that as well. I'm trying to work on allowing people to see this is rough now, but that's a bigger job than trying to journal.
Yeah, that's vulnerability. Like, I'm very proud. I'm feeling very, very proud.
Honestly, you looked like a proud mother when her child graduated from school. Like that look. Ah. Oh.
Yes.
Did you like my surprise segment?
I loved it. I loved it. I loved it. I'll be waxing lyrically about that all week.
So now to the main bit of the podcast that Jan has been warned about. This is none of what comes next is a surprise. So Jan and I have talked a number of times about how a lot of people who hoard are quite arty and creative, and that a lot of us also have a real affection for beautiful or quirky or cute things. And I don't think this is a coincidence, and I know you've had similar thoughts to me. We
Mm.
both know that a lot of people who hoard have 1,000 craft projects either on the go or unstarted. And we both know that a lot of people who hoard see beauty in things that other people might not. So we got curious about it. Um, and we did some reading and some thinking. So we're going to talk about those things today. We're going to start with the arty, crafty side of things. I've had to really get my own craft spending under control and get firm with myself about actually making things rather than just thinking about making them indefinitely. Jan, as a therapist, what do you see in your clients and also based on your knowledge about how much of a trend this is?
For me, I see this in the majority of my clients, who are all female, by the way. I'm not sure what men are up to. I think same, but different, I'm guessing. But so much so that it's one of the most difficult aspects of treating hoarding in my experience. It's that never-ending collection of objects or supplies across often multiple types of crafts as well. It makes it extremely hard to use any sort of traditional CBT behavior techniques to sort of shift that thought pattern. And, there's the potential to kind of create something magical and beautiful, but unfortunately, it doesn't often happen. The getting of the perfect, unique, just right piece so that you're fully prepared to start the project like it's never found.
And you can't start the project because you won't be able to do it perfectly. You also can't start the project because then you won't have the stuff anymore.
Yep. the supplies are too good to use because they're pristine, and then the
Yeah.
guilt of actually opening the package is just too strong. Yeah, exactly. The idea that people who hoard seem to have like this acute perception of marginal details is something mentioned in this book by Rebecca Folkoff. It's called Possessed. It's quite a dense read, but she's got some interesting things to say. Her father was a hoarder, and she suggests that people who hoard seem to have this capacity to really appreciate things that are overlooked by others.
Yeah.
And they're kind of overwhelmed by the sort of bombardment of detail that they kind of seem unwilling to set aside. Like they won't set aside any perception as irrelevant or unimportant. And she actually compares people who hoard to detectives, trying to create like a narrative with a common thread between objects, which I thought was so interesting and thought-provoking. But the idea of appreciating things that other people have overlooked, I also think connects in with the sense of a person feeling like they've been overlooked by others in their life potentially. So they want to make sure that they appreciate the beauty and the uniqueness of objects and things like that. But it's definitely an area that I find really, really hard because there's not this sort of, there's no easy way of convincing someone that they don't need more in order to create something beautiful or bring beautiful things together. So it's something I work on a lot.
I think there are so many aspects of arty craftiness that tie into the things that really stick in the brains of people who hoard. There's so much potential in it, and we see potential everywhere. There's so much identity in it as well. I'm the kind of person who makes crafty things. I always make birthday cards. I always whatever.
Yes.
And also, there's always more. There's always more you can buy. There's always a new project, that kind of literal shiny objects sometimes. And it can and does involve lots and lots of objects. Like very few crafty people, whether they hoard or not, have one small tin of craft things. I've got friends who knit and crochet. Their wool collections.
Oh, yes.
And that's people who don't hoard.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you tie in that kind of with the thinking and the behaviours and the feelings of people who hoard, it seems obvious that it would be a real tripping point.
And I've got a client who's she's a miniature artist. So every single tiny little thing can become just saying, like, I often will ask her, so what would you do with that? I'm always so interested. She's like, well, that could be a cup.
Yeah.
Or it could be, I don't know, well, this could be a picture frame, or it could be.
Yeah.
Wow, that's so cool.
The little thing that keeps the pizza box off it could be a little table.
Exactly. It's like, oh my God, and just the brain just explodes. But of course, she requires so many different types of tools, equipment, objects, it's just never ending. And keeping track of where all those are, and when you have multiple crafts that you engage in, oh, where's my putty knife? Oh, that's now in my other bag with my other stuff. It's like, how can you narrow down as well?
Yeah.
Is the other thing that I attempt to do quite often is which 3 types of crafts or which 2 are your most favourite? And then can we kind of scale down on the acquiring of some other things so that we can actually create some of the projects that you have want to start? That's really hard too, because it's just, I want to do it all. But I'm also, often I hear them sort of say, I'm also actually not sure that I'll be able to do it, or that it won't be perfect, or that I won't be happy with it,
I'm trying really hard to my usual rule for like if I'm justifying keeping something for because I will whatever, whether that's fix it,
Mm,
whatever, then I usually have a rule that I can keep it as long as I've done that within 2 weeks. If
mm,
2 weeks has passed and I still have not sewn up the tear or whatever, then it has to go. And I try to do that if I am justifying keeping a craft project, but it can be a bit trickier because it might be a bigger than a 2 week project.
mm.
But since I was a child, I had a period when I was a child when I wanted to be a clockmaker.
Ah.
Like many childhood periods, that lasted maybe 3 weeks, but um, I've always had a slight fascination with wanting to make a clock. And ages ago, I bought a make a clock kit.
Mm,
And then spent several years going, well, that will be impossibly difficult. There's no point even opening it. I don't know how to make a clock. But because I knew that this was an ambition of many decades, I didn't get rid of the clock kit.
mm.
But I also knew it would be incredibly hard, and so I didn't start it. And I'm embarrassed to say that the thing that made me start it was that broadband in my area went down for about 6 hours.
Forced motivation.
and I was like, and I had specifically planned a night of TV, and so suddenly my planned night, I guess I had a film to watch or something,
Mm.
was not going to happen, and I didn't want to read for whatever reason, and this clock kit was looking at me like, you know what you could do. Anyway, piece by piece, I built a clock. And it was hard, first of all.
Mm.
It was tricky. The instructions were terrible. I didn't know what I was doing, but I was like, well, I'll just do the next bit. I can go back and redo it if it's wrong, but I'll just try this. And after, I don't know, a number of hours, I had made a clock.
Wow.
And do you know what? Bits of it were wonky. But I looked at the wonky bits and went, that just reflects that this was a really hard thing.
And also, no one else is going to have a clock just like your
It's
clock.
precisely wonky in the same ways. It's a unique wonk.
Exactly. It's a unique wonk.
That clock is on my bedroom wall, and I feel quietly proud every time I look at it because I'm like, I made that clock.
Yeah, I made that clock. IKEA effect alert.
Yeah, but with good reason this time.
Yes, yes.
Um, but I think that was an example of like sometimes my usual 2 week rule may need a bit of stretching.
Mm,
But if we can identify why we're not actually doing the thing that we know we want to do,
mm.
it can help us to actually do it.
Yeah, I agree.
If you are in a position to help out the podcast, it would be very much appreciated. You can find out all the ways it's possible to support the podcast at overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk/support. Each and any of them is valued and cherished by me. Thank you. So I read a paper by Amanda Carr. As ever, I will link to any papers or books that we mention on the website. And she talked about whether studio artists who amass a lot of stuff are actually exhibiting hoarding behaviours. And she found a lot of parallels between people who hoard and artists, including higher levels of openness and impulsivity, higher levels of features associated with ADHD and executive dysfunction, as well as difficulties categorizing, organizing, and making decisions. Are these traits that you recognize in the people you work with and the people you've studied?
Yes, I think it's interesting regarding the openness to experience because there are aspects of that personality trait that people who hoard definitely exhibit, in my experience, like intellectual curiosity often, creative thinking, appreciation for the arts, seeing, beauty in the everyday. But adventurousness and maybe openness to emotions perhaps are not so much. And I also would say that people I work with are not so comfortable with ambiguity, which is another aspect of openness to experience.
Yeah.
So it's something I agree in part with that personality trait. And impulsivity in approach behaviours of like moving towards objects, I do see, yes. The need to get it now so that they have it, and the reward system fired up, I see that all the time. And of course, the executive function problems, categorizing, organizing, decision making, they're all central to hoarding in its kind of purest form. And we know ADHD co-occurs with hoarding in about 20% of cases, which I think is conservative, in my opinion.
Yes.
That those are definitely things that are seen in both, artists as well as people who hoard. But there's been, I'm not actually sure where I heard or read it, but they were talking about ADHD and how kind of the wayfinders and the explorers of our time, we are where we are because of people with these types of traits.
Yeah.
It's kind of interesting that it's now considered, I suppose, kind of a disability in a way, but we really need people like that to move us forward. And definitely in these areas of art and, and expansion.
Yeah, I think that's why there's a lot of conversation, isn't there, now in kind of neurodivergent circles about that just alternative operating system rather than faulty operating system.
That's right. And just looking at it from a different, it's a basic difference, but we actually need that in our society.
Yeah.
Otherwise, we won't be able to find those new ideas and move forward.
I'd also add another potential parallel between people who hoard and artists. One of the criteria for the diagnosis of hoarding disorder is that the things people keep are not considered useful. And this is definitely a sticking point for a lot of people. I say tactfully. Because it doesn't involve any scrutiny of who the arbiter of usefulness is. However, I have known a number of artists, and a lot of them keep things because they might be useful for a future project, or because they look interesting, or because they're sure it's perfect for something, they just need to work out what. And obviously that defines the lives of people who hoard as well. Is that a stretch, or could that be a parallel too?
I do think there is a parallel. I mean, the usefulness debate. Is it useful if it's not used? I know it's a kind of judgy thought, the usefulness kind of concept. In whose opinion? In what context? I mean, it's just not. It's just not fair to use that usefulness not considered useful. Yeah. But I guess one of the things successful, another judgment, or productive artists do is they produce art. So yes, they collect or they accumulate objects that they find useful, interesting, beautiful, meaningful, but then they create something unique from them.
Yeah.
And I think that's that without the production, it's possibly hoarding if there's, a distress or functional impairment, if there's some sort of conflict within the person. They're collecting, but they're then not producing. It can cause that distress in the individual. So I guess that's where I would say the differences lie. But usefulness debate, we could be we could be here forever if we debated that.
Indeed, yeah. So while we are obviously not in the game of diagnosing anybody from a distance, there have been famous artists who could arguably have been people who hoard, right?
Mm.
Andy Warhol is one who we'll come on to in a minute in more detail, but this isn't a phenomenon that's unheard of beyond him, right?
No, I'm definitely not. I mean, the nature of being an artist kind of leads them to see all these possibilities. It's like openness to experience. They're finding inspiration in many different objects and environments. I really can't imagine an artist kind of living or existing in an environment of just white walls with nothing to reflect back, because they're reflecting back the world and how they see it. And, there's so many mixed media artists these days who use found objects exclusively to create their art. So there has to be a fair amount of kind of collecting behaviour. But there's this Melbourne artist, Mora. She comes to mind. Her studio was almost impossible to move around. It was like this mystery maze of art supplies and art, where the paths were described as being so narrow that it was almost impossible for her to fall. So when she passed away, her studio was actually packed up and it was auctioned off. So there's this just magical environment, beautiful objects, but then also just rubbish and things that were just part of her life, 90 years of age, making art right up until her last breath, just magical. And she was very much a mixed media artist as well. She made dolls and she painted walls and did amazing, whimsical kind of art. But yeah, I would have looked at that and kind of said, I see some definite hoarding behaviours there. But because she's an artist, it's a completely different lens.
A lot more is allowed. We do give artists a lot of leeway with like, oh, they're an artist. They can get away with all kinds of things.
Well, yeah. And sometimes not of the most tasteful varieties. I think of Picasso when I say that. Yeah, for sure.
Look up Hannah Gadsby if you need more information on that.
Yeah, correct.
So let's talk about people who hoard keeping or acquiring things because we believe them to be beautiful or aesthetic or attractive or appealing in some way. After all, as the great philosopher Mary Poppins once said, a thing of beauty is a joy forever.
Ah, love it.
I think that was when she was getting all the things out of her magic bag. Anyway.
I need to revisit Mary Poppins.
Everybody does. But we never go off track. Never.
No, never. Our attention is never drawn away from the topic ever.
But there is a real contradiction in this. And I can say that clearly because I do it too. Because we acquire or keep the beautiful thing, but do not display it or use it or let it show off its beauty. I try to tell myself that that's an argument for having fewer beautiful things and letting them really shine, which I make the decision to do on principle. But then on an item by item basis, they're all too beautiful to get rid of. So let's try something a bit different. I have an item that I believe to be beautiful, but that I do not use and is not super practical. Talk me into getting rid of this thing that I do believe to be charming. So, I'm not a big designer person. I don't generally care who designed a thing. I care if it looks pretty or not. But there are a couple of like brands and designers where I just tend to like everything they do. Doc Martens, obviously. I like everything they make.
Orla Keeley
is a designer who does these beautiful retro flower type things. Makes me very happy. And I'm glad you brought Orla Keeley up because I have recently been getting on top of my shopping bag situation. I have been getting rid of more shopping bags than most people could acquire in a lifetime. But they are going in big chunks. If you are wondering what to do with bags for life or shopping bags, food banks are desperate for them because people turn up to take food home without enough bags.
Yes.
So once I found that out, I messaged a couple of food banks and said, is this the case for you? They said, God, yes, please. And so I periodically fill one big bag with lots of other big bags and drop them off at a food bank.
Brilliant.
Check with them first. They may not be in that situation, but all the ones I've contacted are. I'm spreading them out, partly so I don't have to admit to having that many bags to one person.
Yes, yes.
But I have this one shopping bag that I do not use because it's kind of, the handles are kind of funny length, and it's just, it's one I always pass over, which is very telling.
Mm.
But
Oh, it is pretty, yes. Ah, yes,
it was designed by Orla Keeley.
yes,
Orla Keeley makes beautiful things, without exception.
yes.
I look at that bag and say, it's not my favourite of her designs, but it remains beautiful. It is a bag I do not use because doesn't quite fit my needs.
Mm.
Talk me into getting rid of the very beautiful but impractical bag, Jan.
Mm. Well, I think you've already given yourself a couple of arguments. One was it's not your favourite design.
Yeah.
It's beautiful, but you probably have other more beautiful things. I kind of would probably, this is where I'd lean into anthropomorphism and suggest that it deserves to be treasured and used by someone who will admire it. Someone who just loves Orla Keeley and this is their favourite colour scheme in their home.
And they're in a fairly miserable position because they've just been to the food bank and they probably don't feel great about themselves. Going home with not only food to feed your family, but an Orla Keeley bag.
I know. You think you hit the jackpot. I would be very happy with that. I can say that right now. But, someone else out there has the capacity to treasure it and to do it justice and use it. So those would be my arguments. It's not fitting that, it's not doing it for you, basically. There's a part of the object that is not fulfilling the need of a shopping bag for you. But that doesn't mean it's not great for, someone else, especially someone at the food bank who would just be thrilled to get an Orla Keeley bag. Ripper, I'd be wrapped. So that would be my arguments.
Yeah, and obviously, again, being an Orla Keeley bag, that's a tough bag that will last 20 years.
Yeah. Yes, because it's that wax it's that wax canvas, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, and it's always really good quality, and I think it's going in the bag that will be the next bag of bags to go to the food bank.
And then, someone out there will definitely love it and treasure it and be thinking, wow.
And I can then look at my remaining Orla Keeley objects that I love without hesitation. Whereas this I like, but with some hesitation. And it gives me more space to appreciate the bits I love without hesitation.
Exactly.
Because I'm not tripping over the bits I quite like with hesitation.
Exactly. No, I think that's you've made a good decision there.
So there's another paper by Anna Chen. And interestingly, I read this paper when Jan and I were planning the episode about digital hoarding a few months ago. And so I was reading it for that episode, and it ended up taking me on this whole tangent about aesthetics and hoarding that made me DM Jan and go, can we do an episode on aesthetics and hoarding, please? Because this is fascinating. So in this paper, she talks about the artist Andy Warhol and how we will go into this, but he had what could arguably be described as a hoard, but because he was an artist, people described it as a collection, which does feel very euphemistic. And other people talked about it, as you mentioned before, like this is just his artistic self-expression.
Exactly.
What do you think those kind of euphemistic way of talking about it, what do you think that tells us?
Well, on the one hand, you can see it as a matter of socioeconomic advantage. And fame, like it's collecting when the person is famous or rich or both, and particularly when the possessions are expensive. It's just a lens through which you look at the behavior. But it also didn't seem to cause him distress. Was that because he was able to kind of pay for unlimited storage, have an assistant do the fetching and carrying? Most likely. But it also didn't stop him from functioning, from creating art, using the spaces for the function that they were intended, that I know of. I mean, I'm only assuming there. But yes, as soon as someone has some sort of, either fame or money, we seem to just view it in a different way. And when they have the space to store, the money to pay for the storage, we try to minimize that and say, oh, no, it's just a collection, just a collection.
It also strikes me that with both somebody like him and in a slightly different way, people who hoard, there's maybe a kind of arrogance to saying people will want this.
Mm.
And for him, we don't know what he was thinking, but I expect some of that was people will want this because it was mine.
Right. Magical thinking around the essence of the him in there.
Yeah. I think with people who hoard, it might be slightly different. It will be people who want this. People will want this because it's valuable or it's pretty or whatever. I think, but there is still there is a slight arrogance of, I have selected this, therefore people will want it.
Well, obviously it's beautiful. Even though we know beauty is in the eye of the beholder, I think it's beautiful. So surely and I think it's valuable. Surely everyone will. There is a little bit of an arrogant sort of taste to it.
Yeah, I'd never really thought of that before, but yeah. So I'm going to read a few sentences here from that paper by Anna Chen that were what sparked the idea for this whole episode. So she said, hoarders also tend to suffer from under-inclusiveness. They see each possession as unique, so it cannot be categorized with other possessions, and thus cannot be organized. The resulting clutter does not reflect a lack of organizational principles, but an overabundance of them. Each object in a pile of clutter is its own category. Yet this perspective of under-inclusiveness also suggests that hoarders approach the world from a more aesthetic point of view than do most people. So I was like, right, tell me more. This is speaking to me. And thankfully she does. She talked about Randy Frost suggesting that, quote, people who hoard see and appreciate features of objects that others overlook, perhaps because of their propensity for visual and spatial qualities and their ability to see uniqueness and value where others see indiscriminate duplication, may stem from particularly inquisitive and creative minds. Can you take that out of that academic language and explain what that might tell us?
Okay, so this is really interesting. It isn't necessarily backed with research that's been replicated, so we're going to take kind of look at it prospectively. But what has been observed in people who hoard is a tendency to see multiple ways an item is unique rather than commonalities. For example, asking someone to sort pencils from pens who doesn't have hoarding tendencies are likely to form two piles, pens and pencils. They might go further and separate the pencils into grey leads and coloured pencils and the pens into colours, or sort by brand. But for a person who hoards, they may sort the pencils into grey leads that have eraser ends that are green from the grey leads with no eraser ends. Then the grey leads that are red are in a separate group. Or they might group them by size. So each pencil could be in a separate group because they've been used and sharpened.
Or, definitely not speaking for myself here, to favourite to least favourite.
Yeah. Exactly. So when you're helping someone, like I might be helping someone sort pieces of string, for example, they might try to sort them by length first and then find none of them are close enough in length, so they have 20 piles, whereas I might have, short, medium and long categories. That's what they mean by under-inclusiveness. Now, a Frost's research group have kind of suggested this hypothesis that perhaps people who hoard have some sort of difference in perception. and they might be able to see things we don't, which is interesting. I've actually got a client who hoards and is also on the spectrum. And due to astigmatism, she sees things sparkle that others don't see and that I don't see. So the other day I got to her place to find her down on the ground picking out stones from the gravel. And they looked like grey rocks to me, just grey gravel rocks. But to her, she could see the sparkles in them like cartoon twinkling stars. So interesting, right? So even seeing like the lights and things like that, she sees something completely different from what I see. So I read this article this week about cortical gyrification, which is a different method of investigating brain structures by measuring kind of the complexity of brain folds using an MRI. And please don't come for me. I'm not a neuroscientist, but I kind of understand what the method does. And you can put a link to the paper in the show notes for those who kind of want to do a deep dive. But basically, more folds indicate greater cognitive function in particular brain regions. All right. So the findings in this, it's a first ever small sample size MRI study, compared people who hoard with healthy controls, indicated that people who hoard have lower cognitive function in a number of really interesting areas. So we're just going to geek out for a bit. Firstly is the fusiform gyrus, better known or best known for its involvement in the recognition of faces. So people who have issues around face recognition, prosopagnosia, have issues in this area.
That's me.
You, and it plays a pivotal role in high-level visual and cognitive functions, including distinguishing between categories of objects. So this is the under-inclusiveness Anna Chen's talking about.
Wow.
The fusiform gyrus is also involved in multi-sensory integration in colour processing. This could be why many of my clients love very bright colours. Just spitballing. There was also lower level functioning in the parahippocampal gyrus, which kind of collabs with a lot of areas. But of note for us is episodic memory. So our memories for personal history, and additionally our ability to navigate in our space, which is our visuospatial process. Our ability to use a map, store and recall visual information, look ahead and kind of chart our path. Even understanding how close objects are to one another are based on the functioning in this area, right? So you can see where I'm interested. I'm going, okay. I was like you. I was like, tell me more. What's going on? There's also lower functioning in the lingual gyrus, which is pivotal in visual memory storage. So it also plays a role in our ability to kind of logically order events. So all of this is giving us more of a picture of those visual functions that are really key in this kind of artistic, aesthetic perspective that hoarders potentially have. So perhaps this is the direct link that we've been looking for having items in sight, because there's not that memory, they're not able to recall. Perhaps this allows us to understand why the objects do feel like a physical representation of a person who hoards personal history, because, well, it is. And if they're unable to retrieve episodic memories, they then use items to remind them instead. Perhaps even going further, where they're placed within the piles shows them roughly when it happened, because they can't remember the logic of the order of events. I don't know. I mean, it's crazy.
That last bit, let me just take a moment, because that absolutely applies to me. I sometimes feel like I'm doing an archaeological dig and I'm like, okay, that was then because it's with that.
And then you go, I thought that was before that or after that, right?
Yeah, I'm just having a moment here. Yeah.
Yeah, this just kind of like this was, like my tiny brain just kind of exploded a bit with this, because there was a chunk of things in here. And again, I will repeat, it was a very small sample.
Yeah.
But they did have controls. They had healthy controls and people who hoard. I think it was wasn't a tiny sample. It wasn't minute. It was 28 or 30 people. So it was a fair number for this type of sort of MRI study. But I was like, The other thing about it is that they're just discussing the fact that it could be some sort of neurodevelopmental aspect to this, because chances are that the actual forming of those folds in the brain occurs at a very young age.
Right.
And so they're surmising that because there are less folds, potentially it is something that is neurodevelopmental. Hey, again, we're all kind of moving ourselves towards that notion of it being something that's neurodevelopmental anyway.
Yeah, yeah.
So I thought that was kind of mind-blowing.
I hope you're finding this episode interesting. In order to help me continue bringing you content like this week after week, your support is crucial. This independent podcast wouldn't be possible without listeners like you. I pour my heart and soul into it, and I fund the podcast myself, from microphones to computer software to hosting costs. So I'm asking for your help if you can. Whether you can offer a one-off donation or you want to become a de-hoarding darling with a monthly contribution, any amount makes a huge difference. Find out more at overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk/donate. So Andy Warhol would periodically stick everything on his desk into a box and call it an archive. He considered selling these, and one commentator said, Andy turned chronic acquisitiveness into something profoundly artful. And an archivist said, like a contemporary culture archaeological dig, the layers of disorder will reveal valuable insights into Warhol and his time. Are people who hoard just unappreciated artists?
Yeah, potentially. I actually have taken a look at the Warhol Museum website, and it seems many of these archive boxes do hold his art and other photography negatives and proofs and things, along with whatever was on his desk, even things like used chewing gum. But I think what makes this different from hoarding, in my opinion, is that it seems Andy was kind of able to let go of these items and essentially discard them without distress. I mean, okay, he still kept them, like some clients keep multiple storage units with possessions they haven't seen in dozens of years. It's the same sort of thing. But there was some sense of purpose in the archiving. Like, I think it was a deliberate choice.
But even that makes me think maybe there wasn't distress because he'd found the way he could dispose of them perfectly for him.
Yes, that's a good point. Yeah, very good point.
Like, people who hoard have less distress if they can get rid of something the right way.
Yes, that's a very good point.
And if for him that was the right way.
Exactly. I think that is a fair point. I think that I was rereading the book Stuff, Compulsive Hoarding and the Meaning of Things. Randy Frost and Gail Steckity were interviewing a woman who described how she began piling clothes, papers, books and memorabilia, like playbills, in a pile in the middle of her dorm room during her first year of college. And she always meant to organise the stuff and put it away, but she didn't. Finally, the dome-shaped pile began to remind this woman of an ancient burial mound with an aesthetic mixture of textures and colours. So both her and her roommate came to see it as an odd piece of art, a stuff sculpture. It seemed that the shape and colour was kind of pleasing to her, and the thing sticking out kind of reminded her of events and memories. So again, that's what we're reflecting back on with that article, with that research. Interestingly, she felt that taking the pile apart was unthinkable, and even changing it was too difficult to contemplate. So, I mean, you could be right. Andy found he didn't feel the need to keep the stuff structure or the stuff sculpture in situ like this person. What are your thoughts on that? Is it just a different form of the same thing?
I'm definitely still trying to work it out. I can absolutely see myself fully getting why a pile of clothes in a particular format would end up becoming its own aesthetic thing. I can fully see that. And I think, yeah, it's really tricky. There's definitely something in it about the way there are definite parallels between the way some artists look at objects and the way some hoarders look at objects. There are definite contradictions in the way we as a society talk about artists doing that versus hoarders doing that. I think that's something I'm quite fascinated in now. That in some ways the same behavior is looked at very, very differently. There's definitely also something in what you said earlier about, but the artists often do actually use the thing.
Yeah, like the
Yeah, it's really interesting. It's really interesting because there's crossover. I'm not saying artists are hoarders or hoarders are artists, but I think the crossovers are quite fascinating to look at. And
yes.
Anna Chen again talks about other art installations that explored an excess of stuff in an artistic way. She said these portray hoarding perhaps as not as a less than rational or inhuman failing, nor as indiscriminate accumulation, but rather as an all too human endeavour to excavate and sculpt a sense of self and purpose through one's possessions. And I feel in my soul like this is some of my story in a way that I'm still working out. I also feel like it's a really, really misguided bit of my soul and my story. So, can it be that these artists are representing something that's real but not healthy?
Yeah, I guess that could be the case. I mean, there are potentially more healthy ways to do this, which, is kind of part of the journey of getting in touch with your possessions. I do think often artists are kind of making a statement about our culture, consumerism,
Yeah.
materialism, and the drive for new shiny stuff. Perhaps needs to be explored, and art's a really great way to do that. So I do see that. I've seen some amazing work, really, really brilliant found object art. I've actually got a really good article that I'll send you as well with just some amazing pictures. But yeah, I that whole sense of self and purpose through your possessions, it's very easy to get kind of sucked into that, I guess, feel that those things can actually reflect who you are, which may or may not be healthy. It's a tricky question.
And I guess it's that thing of recognizing that something might explain why we do something, but it doesn't justify why we do something.
Yeah.
If we are on some level archiving our lives because we are trying to, quote, excavate and sculpt a sense of self and purpose through our possessions, unquote, can we talk about that? Because it might explain some hoarding behaviors, but it's also suffocating us. What are some ways we can challenge this thinking that leads us to believe this is the way we create or represent ourself or our purpose?
Look, we all kind of fall prey to the possessions are an extension of our sense of self, using what we own to signal to everyone, who we are and what we believe in. Fake it till you make it kind of stuff, I guess. For the person who hoards, their relationship status with their stuff, I guess, could be categorized as it's complicated, right? It's a very complicated relationship.
I can see why you did a PhD. Conclusion, complicated stuff, this.
Facebook status, relationship status, how's your relationship with this stuff? It's complicated. I think that sometimes we don't ask the right questions of ourselves when we're getting in touch with our stuff and our reasons for acquiring and saving them. Like, we don't approach it as an existential crisis of identity and meaning, but like maybe we should.
Yeah.
Maybe digging deep and working out what does bring us meaning in our life is where we might need to begin and kind of persevere until we're clear on who we want to be and what our purpose truly is. And then approach the objects in our lives and hold them up to scrutiny. Make them earn their place. Do they assist us, or do they enable us to fulfill our purpose in a tangible way? Yes, keep. No, they go. Perhaps we do need to take it to that level of mindfulness around our possessions. One of the things you mentioned earlier was when you are thinking broadly about your stuff, you have this thought process. Look, unless it's beautiful, I can't keep it. But then when you come down to the single object, it's very, very difficult to make that decision. And that is something I find every day with people I work with. There's this difficulty going from the big picture to coming down to the object and then seeing those marginal differences and seeing that uniqueness with each individual item. So that is something that maybe, can be worked on, that cognitive flexibility from big picture to little and back again. But I guess the only way to do that is to acknowledge that it's a problem and then practice shifting from the big picture to the small and back again.
And holding on to the big picture principle when you're in the little picture is the thing, isn't it?
And that could be around that visual perception stuff too, because you might not be able to hold that in your mind. And maybe it's about, sounds really naff, but the vision board idea or the Pinterest board or something like that, having that picture to say, well, that's what I want my place to look like. I've seen these pictures. It's not perfect, but it's how I would like it. Keep them in mind rather than not having a physical picture, because you might not be able to imagine that in your mind vividly.
I think that principle, that difficulty applies in so many areas of life. Like, you might be big picture, I want to get fit. Little picture, I'm not going to the gym now.
Yeah.
It's...
That's crazy talk. I'm not going to the gym.
And we can't always make those match up. We know that in order to get fit, big picture, we need to go to the gym 3 times a week or whatever the goal is. But the actual right now, go to the gym, almost offended, feels very disconnected to the big picture of I want to get fit.
Yeah.
Or like, I want to eat healthier, except for this one Mars bar, obviously.
Yeah. Yes. Very, very true. We've talked about that before, how we see our future self as a completely different person. It's like future Jan wants to get fit, but that's her problem. Right now, it's donut time, and I'm going to eat it.
Exactly.
Oh, yes.
So tying all of this together, I used to have a really big fear that a tidy home meant having a home that didn't have personality, didn't have a soul. That if I had a tidy home, that meant a home that was generic and sterile and cookie cutter. I feel like the conversation about art and aesthetics and the conversation about representing ourselves with our stuff are both relevant to that fear. I now don't believe that tidy homes are sterile and soulless. I believe some tidy homes are cookie cutter and sterile and soulless, but they don't have to be. And that has been an important shift for me and what I'm kind of working towards. What are any thoughts you have about people who have that same fear I used to have.
Thank you for bringing this up because it makes me think of those cheesy fridge magnets. A tidy house is a sign of a wasted life. Super judgy as well. But,
Yeah, yeah.
we're at that all or nothing black and white thinking again. Like, yes, some houses look like no one lives there. It's totally true. They're beige and lifeless and depressing. But equally, a house that's dark, stuffy, dusty, extremely cluttered with disorganized piles of stuff is equally lifeless and depressing because there's nowhere to live or to relax or to eat or play or just to be. So, I mean, it's kind of like, yes, you might have all this space, but if it's beige and lifeless, it is going to depress you either way. But, I give you permission to be a maximalist. Clutter core is a thing. Google
that
it.
is fully my aesthetic. Even if I ever achieve a home that is not hoarded, it will be busy.
It will be fabulously busy.
But I want that. Yeah.
I love that. I love that. Don't feel ashamed to have your shelves filled with your most precious things.
No, I love that. Yeah.
Have bright, sunny colours clashing everywhere, Display your collection of Barbies or your Beanie Babies or whatever. But promise yourself that you will create aesthetically pleasing displays of your, really most beloved objects, photos, memorabilia, and interact with your things. Pick them up, dust them, clean them, rearrange them. Consider their meaning and their role in your life regularly. I think that's really important. And respect yourself enough to take care of your environment, just as you would treat a loved one. Respect the environment that you're living in. But just interacting with stuff, just go for it. Just go for it. But be all in, I reckon, and make sure that it's in an environment that you want to sit in for hours and just soak up the the maximalism of it all. I think that's cool.
Yeah.
I'd like to be a maximalist. I'm not, but I'd like it.
I don't think you. I could fully see you wanting to, and then not being able to bring yourself to do it.
Going, oh my god, yeah, I so want it. Like I look at all those pictures, like, oh, I love that.
It's gorgeous. Yeah,
there's just so much to look at, and it's so bright and beautiful. And then I go, I think just a white bench.
Yeah.
Just a white bench. That's good. Some areas of my home, like my bookshelves and things like that, they're quite cluttered and interesting. But yeah, I love some of those.
Yeah, because I think what we're talking about is it doesn't have to be either living in a hoard or living in the kind of place where somebody whips your teacup away before you've even finished your tea. You don't touch anything. Yes. There are a million gradations between those two, and we all sit in a slightly different one. But it doesn't, if other people have the same fear I do, that if I clean up, everything will be soulless and generic. That's just not true.
I don't think it could happen because, that's just not who you are. No. It's not going to occur. You will make it your oasis of, Barbie pink stuff if that's what you love so much. But I guess respect yourself enough to create that space. Yeah. That's kind of
And if you've lived in a hoard for a really long time, it might take some work to work out what you would actually want your space to look like. I kind of know what I would want my space to look like, but it took me a bit to work that out. And it may be that I create the space I'm imagining and it's not quite right, and I can still change it because I'm not committing for life to something. I'm trying things out.
Yeah, exactly. And you can change it. I know that's absolutely mind-blowing, but it doesn't have to stay where you put it the first time.
Jan, it is extra question time. You know the score. Number between 1 and 76. This is the bit where I ask guests an extra question. It's sometimes a slightly silly one, and Dehoarding Darlings get access to this extra question and the answer. If you would like to become a Dehoarding Darling, go to overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk/darling. So, Jan, interesting. That was one of those that really gave me a lot to think about. And yeah, I think it's a very interesting way to look at this problem in a slightly different context.
I agree.
So, if people want to find you online, I believe there are ways they can do that.
There are ways. Very, very interesting ways. No, not really. But you can find me on Instagram.
Same ways as every time.
Same ways as everyone else. You can find me on all the normal platforms, Instagram, X, and Pinterest at stuff_ology, or Facebook at Stuffology Consulting. You could pop by the website and sign up for the free weekly newsletter if you want. And please send me an email at jan.stuffology.com.au if you want to have a chat.
And as always, I will say that the newsletter comes highly recommended for weekly insight into this weird thing our brains are doing. And also, I will link to all of Jan's social media, website, everything like that from the website at overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk. Jan, thank you very much.
Pleasure as always. May we take a moment to reflect on the meaning of place and acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we record and listen to this podcast today. I am speaking on the lands of the Boon Wurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and I acknowledge their connection to country, both land and sea, and culture. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples listening today.
It's the bit where that hoarder shouts out someone wise.
Shout out this week to the Best Life podcast, where friend of this show, Paige Pritchard, is talking about when you're really tempted by the new shiny thing that you want to buy. Have a listen.
It's almost kind of getting to the realization of that. And I think a really helpful place to start with that is going through and almost just kind of like identifying and making a list of what were all the things that I bought that I almost kind of like told myself, okay, this is it. This is a mindset that I feel like a lot of people get in. It's like, I'll be happy when I can have this one last thing. And that's it. That's the last thing I'm ever going to want. Like, once I have this thing, I'll never want anything else ever again. But then it's like, we get the thing, we get the rush. It feels super exciting for a couple days, maybe a couple weeks if it's a bigger ticket item. And then we always just wind up back to exactly where we started, of just like, okay, but now it's this thing. Now it's this thing. And what happens is like a lot of us don't slow down long enough to realize like, wait a second, maybe it's not actually the product's job to do that for me or to give that to me. We just think that the fault lies with the product. We're like, oh, no, that just wasn't it. That just wasn't it. It wasn't the right thing. It wasn't the right product. It wasn't the right program or system or whatever. I know you guys probably see this a ton in the fitness world. So it's got to be this thing now. And it's just this hamster wheel that we constantly get ourselves on because we are trying to fill emotional voids with things in our external world. And it's never going to work. Like, it's just a hamster wheel you're going to get yourself on, and you won't get yourself off unless you elect to get off.
So I will link to the Best Life podcast and indeed the episode of this podcast where Paige was interviewed in the show notes at overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk. And thank you for listening, and I will speak to you next time. Thank you for listening to That Hoarder Overcome Compulsive Hoarding podcast. It's been a pleasure to have you on board. You can find all the links I've mentioned and a transcript of the episode online at overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk. To find out more about how you can support this podcast and the overall project, go to overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk/support. and do subscribe to the podcast so you make sure you don't miss any future episodes. There may be links in this podcast that earn me money. This doesn't come at any extra cost to you if you make a purchase through those links, and it helps to support the podcast. So now to the main bit of the podcast that Jane? Who's Jane? I definitely can't relate to that.
No, I'm not talking about you. I promise.
You're totally talking about me. Carry on. The layers of disorder will not as a less than rational or inhuman failing, nor as indiscriminate accumulation, but rather as an all too human endeavour to excavate and sculpt a sense of self and purpose through one's possessions. I got all the way through that quote and then screwed up the last word.
Post-production.
And if we are, on some level, arcing our lives, but not arcing our lives. Should I try that again? Reading is apparently hard. Anyway.
Yeah.
If we are, on some level, archiving our lives... I was going to say something and I've completely forgotten. I was probably going to go into my usual how great the newsletter is, so I'll do that. This final question makes me lose the will to live every single week. I cannot bear this question. I don't know why. I don't know. And I would highly...
It doesn't sound that convincing.
I would highly recommend them.
I highly recommend it.
Flaming newsletter again, as I always do.
I'm rolling my eyes back.
It is a very good newsletter. I'm just so bored of recommending it. Okay, here we go. Enthusiastic voice.